Well, cool. Well, we don't have to talk anymore about Boston politics right now. I'm excited for you to join us. I think to kind of get this started, one of the reasons why we wanted to have you on is because you spend a lot of time talking about Appalachian stereotypes and how the region is really misunderstood. And your forthcoming book, I think, really tees that up perfectly in the title, where it's another Appalachia coming up, queer and Indian in a mountain place, because it really challenges a lot of the pre-held beliefs about Appalachia that it's totally just full of white people who are Christian, straight, that type of construct in people's minds, and it immediately out of the gate challenges that. I think that's really cool. And before we get fully into that, I did want to ask you, kind of to talk a little bit about where you're from. We do this a lot with guests, particularly from Appalachia, and I think based on what I've read, because I haven't been around Cross Lanes a lot, but just based on the description, it sounded fairly similar to the area where John and I grew up in Parkersburg. There's a lot of chemical plants, a lot of different dynamics going along with that. So kind of interested to hear your take about that.
Yeah, 100%. So Parkersburg has a carbide plant, same way that the Chemical Valley and the Kanawha Valley does. My dad used to go to Parkersburg for work a lot. So yeah, I mean, I think even that part of my story is a different Appalachian story than I think the prevailing narrative, right? Which is a lot about coal. And the sort of folks who grew up in the chemicals part of Appalachia have some similarities in their stories, but also some differences. Environmental destruction is kind of the same story for all of us, right? And the really hard relationship between like needing to work and needing jobs, and then the industries that offer those jobs being ones that are profoundly destructive to our environment. I think that tension exists whether you grow up in coal Appalachia or chemicals Appalachia. I think the difference is that in the case of both Parkersburg and of Nitro Cross Lanes Institute, which is kind of the world I grew up in, there was a significant community of immigrants who moved in to work in the chemical industry. So in South Charleston, there was a tech center, which was Union Carbide's research and development for the entire corporation was housed in South Charleston. Tons of PhD folks, both from the United States and also internationally, were coming into work at the tech center. My dad came in to work at the plant as a physician. He did occupational medicine, so he was the plant doctor at the Institute plant. That story is not a story I think people know. Like, I don't think people know that there were like over 100 Indian families in Charleston, many of whom were drawn there by the chemical industry. And so I think like we knew we were there, but I think that from the outside, I don't think people we knew were there. And that was my experience all the time. Once I left West Virginia, when I would tell people where I was from, their response was just always like, there aren't Indian people in West Virginia. Like, what are you talking about? All the Indian people are from New Jersey. And it was just like, okay, I'm pretty sure I'm from there. Like, I grew up there, but sure, have your notion of what you think Appalachia is. It just, I think for a long time, I just sort of feel like my friends and I were like, okay, well, this is where we grew up. We grew up, Cross Lanes is a very strange place. I don't know if you've ever driven through. That's what most people who don't live there do, is drive through. You probably filled up gas there, right? It's kind of this.
I think I did an escape game there once because they had it at a strip mall.
There.
Oh, there
I
you
did
go.
a job interview there, so I know Cross Lanes pretty well. I had to go there a few times.
Yeah, so like gas station, couple of restaurants, couple of housing developments, right? It
Yeah.
really did kind of come up relative to the chemical plant. That's a lot of its existence was like, well, we have some housing in Nitro that's a lot for workers. We're going to build some additional housing in Cross Lanes that's kind of more like management. It's a bedroom community in a way that, again, I don't think people think about Appalachia as a place where you have bedroom communities, but Cross Lanes in a way is very much a bedroom community. Its existence was to be a place for people to live, but they didn't work there for the most part. They worked in other places.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that's kind of where I grew up, is in this space that I think is largely invisible in the narrative of the sort of like externally created narrative about what Appalachia is or who lives there.
Yeah, that's super interesting, especially your point about how the Indian community where you live, like you all knew you were there, but nobody else did. And I will confess, I had no idea that South Charleston had such a large Indian community either. And I guess, thinking about it does make sense. And I actually didn't realize there was a Union Carbide plant there either, because my grandpa used to work at one in Marietta, Ohio. That's neither here nor there, but I think that's a really interesting, I'll say, origin story, because I feel like so much of that history of Appalachia has been overlooked for so long, mainly because I think a lot of voices that are parts of different communities that weren't like white or affluent have been marginalized. I think, and I pulled this from an article actually you wrote. I don't know if this is an excerpt from your book or not, but you mentioned kind of the way that you framed your life, and I think it's really interesting. I like how you do it. You said that you straddled oftentimes two different worlds, between a boom and bust in the West Virginia economy, being an immigrant and a citizen, queer and heterosexual, etc. And that the stories, Appalachian stories like yours, are about like brown people, queer people, immigrants, and radicals, and should be told more often. And I think that that is such a perfect way to encapsulate, something that we really hope to do by highlighting other people's voices on this show, showing that there are those real stories. There are stories about brown people, queer people, immigrants, and especially radicals in Appalachia. I realize it's not a question. I just wanted to point that out. I thought that was really great framing. I'm kind of curious, how did you come about wanting to talk about your story, about where you grew up? Because I know that it's complicated for a lot of people.
It is really complicated. And it's even more complicated, I think, when you didn't learn when you were growing up that there were other people like you, right? Like, I didn't learn in school about the Battle of Blair Mountain. I didn't learn about radicals growing up in West Virginia. I was old by the time I knew that history, and I'm ashamed to say that, but I also am like, what happened in my education that, like, I wasn't taught these things. I wasn't taught about queer writers. I wasn't taught, like, I didn't read an Appalachian writer in school the whole time I was in school. My neighbor gave me Crumb by Lee Maynard when I was in high school to read, and I loved it. And I went to school and told a teacher about it, and she was like, that book is filthy. We can't talk about that book in school. And I was like, but that book sounds like people I know. I don't know if you've read Crumb. His voice is the voice of my neighbor, right? Like,
Yeah.
it was a powerful thing for me to be like, oh, that voice isn't just my neighbor's voice. Like, that voice can be in a book. I read Brees DJ Pancake just a few years ago, and when I was reading that book, I was like, oh my God, like, this guy writes about home in a way that, like, I feel on like a cellular level, but I never knew those stories when I was growing up. And so it took me a long time to feel like my story had any weight. Like, if you never see stories that reflect you, it's hard to believe that anyone else is going to want to read your story. I think when I really started to feel a sense of urgency about telling the story was actually around the publication of a book that shall not be named by a person running for office in Ohio who shall also not be named, because I picked up that book and I thought it was a memoir, and then I got about halfway through and I was like, this is not a memoir. And even if it was a memoir, like, I don't know the thing he's describing. Like, that's not my thing, and it's not the thing of anybody I know. And like, I was in Boston, right? So all these people in Boston are buying this book and being like, oh, have you read this book about Appalachia? Because they don't know how to say Appalachia. This amazing book. And I just, like, was getting madder and madder and madder. I was like, no, this book is not what you think it is. Like, you're not reading it right. If you were reading it right, you'd read that this is just like some dude's, like, political philosophy masquerading as memoir. And the philosophy is actually really horrible and doesn't, like, do any justice to the people who live in this place. And I was like, well, I can keep being mad about this book, or I can shut up and start writing. And say, like, if I think there's a different story, then, like, I have to tell it. Like, otherwise, that's the story people are reading right now. And the thing is, it didn't mean that there weren't other people writing other work in Appalachia that was incredible and powerful. Like, all that work also existed. None of it was the story of the people I knew, right? Or the kind of intersection that I grew up at. That intersection isn't a story that I feel like anyone had told as yet. And it felt like more and more urgent and important to me to sort of, like, get that story down. Also because I don't know how long that story is going to go on. Like, what, you guys know this better than anybody. Like, West Virginia's population is declining. The chemical industry is largely really suffering and struggling and on its way out. I'm not sure, like, over time, how much this kind of like small cohort of Indian immigrants and their descendants like are going to be in that space. So if I don't tell that story now, like, what happens if in 2 generations or in a generation, like, that's not a community that's there anymore? Like, what happens to our story and what happens to that moment? It just felt like there were all these questions about whose stories are being told and for what purpose, that made me sort of feel like, well, if I think that there's a story I want to tell and I have a purpose for telling it, I think the time is now.
That makes total sense. That so I guess now that you mentioned kind of obviously the book that shall not be named, the author that shall not be named. So in a way, I know that this is not what it's meant to be, but in a way, it's somewhat of another response to that book from a perspective that we've not yet heard. Is that essentially what you're portraying here? Like we haven't really heard. We've heard from Appalachians, we know
Yeah.
that, but we may not have heard from all Appalachians.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's like a clap back in the sense of
Right.
like I'm going one for one with the ideas in that book. It's not
Yeah.
that. But it is an attempt. I think that word another is really important, right? And I think there are a lot of anothers. I think Silas House offers us another Appalachia. I
Yeah.
think that Crystal Wilkinson offers us another Appalachia. I think Frank X. Walker offers us another Appalachia. Like, I think the another is the most important thing. And it's not like I'm saying I'm the only another. I'm saying
Right.
there are a whole bunch of us anothers out here. And so when we're looking at Appalachia and we're thinking about who is Appalachian, who does this community entail? It entails the same people who live in all of the rest of the country. And that is not the kind of story that I feel like that particular book offers about Appalachia.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing is I'm glad you keyed in on the word, another, because if you look at all of the stories that we're talking about right now, there is one that everybody can take a look at who's actually from here and say this is bullshit, while all the other ones have merit. Like people are able to go, "Oh, this isn't exactly my story, but I remember, this was their Uncle Joe, this was my neighbor Jim, like this is, to this point, So it's interesting to hear that. I think that it does fit in and mesh really well with, I won't call them competing stories, but just other stories, from the real stories from the region.
Yeah.
So I guess my next question would be, how different, or I guess maybe how difficult was it, and it may not have been at all, how difficult was it to, one, I guess, grow up with in Appalachia with maybe different mindsets than some of the people around? I know that obviously that's hit or miss. How difficult was that? And how difficult was it to write a book about it? Well, I mean, was it pretty easy to come naturally, or was it difficult to sit down and think about those things?
Yeah, it wasn't easy. I grew up on like a really incredible street. I feel like probably everyone in West Virginia feels this way about their neighbors, but I'm gonna take a claim that my neighbors on Pamela Circle were the best neighbors that any human being anywhere could have. I'd fight people on that. I had the best neighbors. They were incredible. They were so loving. They were home for my family in a way that like my blood relatives were 8,000 miles away.
Yep.
My Pamela Circle neighbors, who were all white, largely working class folks, like they were my family. So I had that, and that was my safe space, and that was home. School was a lot harder. You know, there were Confederate flags everywhere.
Yeah.
People, I was 6 the first time I got slapped and called the N-word. Like that stuff, like it happened. It definitely happened. It happened a lot.
Yeah.
I didn't have anywhere to go to make sense of it. It didn't have a lot of teachers of color. It didn't really feel like I could talk to my parents about it. Like it was hard enough for them to navigate being immigrants in Appalachia for me to then go home and be like, oh, and by the way, like here's what's happening to me at school. So I didn't. So there was a lot of hard. There was a lot of hard around race. There was a lot of hard around gender. And like trying to figure out, well, like, what's my gender identity supposed to be in this space? Like, I'm an Indian girl. So like in terms of dating or desirability, like I'm not really sure where I fit in all these paradigms. Like, what does this mean for me? there was a lot of like trying to make meaning of your identity in the absence of models. That was hard. I'm a lot older now, and so I can sort of hold the hard in balance with like a lot of really loving people who just like the relationships I have from growing up, I still have, right? There are people who are still in my life and still so important to me. I think a lot of people who grow up in other places don't have those kind of relationships. So I guess I sort of take it with like, you keep the nectar, you throw away the sting a little bit. There was a lot of nectar that I feel like I was able to hold on to. When it came to writing, I think some of the hardest things to write about weren't the things that happened in the past. I think some of the hardest things to write about were actually the things that started to happen around the 2016 election, where people who had shown me and my family a lot of love growing up started to say things and do things and post things that were really painful. And like I felt like they clearly couldn't be seeing us. Like there's no way that when they were posting, they were seeing how that was going to land on my brown queer immigrant body, on my parents' brown immigrant bodies. Like I knew they weren't seeing us, but it was also really hard to be like, how can you not see us? Like you saw us, you know the things this person is saying that are xenophobic and hateful and homophobic. Like you know that we are all the things that you're now posting negative comments about. Trying to parse that was probably the hardest thing, because like holding people who you've loved so deeply with like deep regard and also asking really hard questions about why they're making the choices they're making, writing my way through that I think was really, really difficult. And I tried so hard to like hold people with empathy the whole way through. But I feel like I will always like in my head be thinking like, did I do enough to like hold them with empathy as we like work through this really hard thing that I think is really familiar for a lot of folks. I don't think I'm the only person who has had that experience of sort of watching people you really care about start to have beliefs that you're like, I don't understand where this is coming from. And I can guarantee that you've forgotten who I am a little bit. If you're saying these things, or you've forgotten our relationship a little bit if you're saying these things. I think that's a very shared experience for a lot of folks. And it's, I think, was hard to write it while you're also still trying to make sense of it because it's still happening.
Yeah. I'm glad you shared that story, because I think it's really helpful to hear that and to understand that from you, because we have so many people, so many listeners who are either people who've moved outside the region for one reason or another, or who still live in the region, particularly people who identify as LGBTQ, who are still to this day kind of struggling, either it be maybe with family or just the environment that they live in Appalachia, with people who aren't accepting of just who they are. And I think like, something we really try to do on this show is both push back against the stereotypes and show that like these are problems that happen everywhere in the country, but it is still also a problem in Appalachia. And I'm kind of curious, like, how do you approach your story and approach like reconciling with that, to tell your story? Because everybody's Appalachia story is different, but I feel like everybody's story is also pretty complex, and it seems like you would have a pretty unique perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I definitely am not trying to tell anyone's other story, a story other than my own, and like my own is even like narrower and more niche than like my friend who's also Indian who grew up in 2 blocks over from me, but like is straight and whatever. Like I'm clear that like I can only tell a story that like is really specific to like the set of intersections I grew up at, which may overlap with some other people's intersections, but also may not. What's been kind of powerful for me is like as I've written the essays in this and as they've gotten published, it's been really powerful to get messages from people being like, I saw myself here in this essay. And another person being like, well, I saw myself here and I saw myself here. And it's like, oh, if I'm writing at the intersection of like 6 different identities and you see yourself at one of those, that's still more in some cases for people than they've ever seen themselves in a piece of writing before. Right. So that I think has been really powerful, which is like, I don't have to tell everybody's story, but if I can be really honest about telling my story and all the different pieces of it, maybe you can see yourself in one of those pieces. Maybe you see yourself in two of those pieces. I like a woman tweeted at me, like a queer Desi woman who grew up in West Virginia. She's a lot younger than I am, but she's like, I've never felt so seen as I just did in this like piece of writing that you shared, right? And I'm like, well, shoot, like, okay, like it's not all of your story, but some pieces in there really hit for you. I think that's all I'm going for. Like, I want some pieces to hit for everybody, or to hit for as many people as it can. And most importantly, I want for the folks who are like sitting at the most marginalized of those intersections to maybe get a chance to see a little bit of themselves reflected in a story that they haven't gotten to see before, where like the word Appalachian and the word Desi or Indian go beside each other, and the word Appalachian and the word queer go beside each other, and the word Appalachian and the word radical like go beside each other. And it's like, we can put those words beside each other again and again, and we can put two of them together or three of them together and four of them together, and like all of them can still be held under the umbrella of Appalachian. Because I think even for people growing up in Appalachia, like that's not a word I always felt like I could claim. I born and raised in West Virginia, and I was like, am I Appalachian? Actually, there's a whole essay at the end of the book that's like, do I get to keep this? Like, can I claim this word if my family's only here for a generation? And I think yes. Like, I think yes, but I think it is a thing that people struggle with. If there's one dominant definition of what Appalachia is and you don't fit it or match it, I think a lot of the time people end up asking questions about themselves and like feeling like they're the imposter, as opposed to asking a question about, well, like maybe this definition is kind of broken and maybe we have to blow up the definition and expand it and allow for it to hold a broader set of identities than popular culture or media or whoever is allowing it to currently hold.
I love that. I love that term, blowing up the definition of Appalachia. I think that is a fantastic way of putting it.
Yeah, that is really good. I do want to say though, you are hitting on points that you're trying to portray, because for instance, technically on my mom's side, I'm a first generation Appalachian. So I struggled with that too. Like for the longest time, I told people that, well, my family's from Connecticut, and then that was really, I didn't know if I should claim it or not. It was one of those things. So I totally relate to that. And I can relate to the fact that, you talk about your family being so far away. We had zero family in West Virginia. So, our neighbors became our family, and it was, it's one of those things. And so I totally get where you're laying down. That's what I say, going back to that book, the other book, is you can look at that and say like, this is bullshit. But even if, you and I are on pretty far opposite ends of a spectrum, right? I'm a white guy, right? I'm straight. Most of the time you think, oh, their stories would never match. But, right there, I'm talking about two of the huge points that you're making. And we do match up. And I think it's because Appalachia is so unique that it has a lot of people who may not look the same or may not identify the same, but their stories tend to at least somewhat look similar. And I think that that's always been the greatest part about Appalachia, is like there's always been this unique common sense, between people, even if they don't know it at the time.
Yeah. I think since not living there, I feel like I have really been able to sort of like clearly identify that the way that place shapes identity in Appalachia is something completely different than anywhere else I've ever lived. Like for me, place is as important a character in my book as any of the people are. Like place is a person in the book in the way. Like growing up where I grew up is so much about who I am. The geography of where I grew up, the context, like that's a ton of my identity, as much as my relationships with individual people are. That sort of boundedness to place, I think, is a thing that a lot of people feel. Like that's why you have like things like Appodlachia. Like what other region of the country has a word to describe people who don't live there anymore, but like have this profound sense of loss and nostalgia and connection to the place where they grew up? We don't have like Appalachia. No one is an Appalachian, or it's just not a thing. But like Appalachia is a thing because we are all so bound to place and to people. in ways that I think are really powerful and really, like I think there's a lot the rest of the country could learn from Appalachia in terms of like what it means to like be in relationship with people and be in relationship with place. And I just don't think that is the way Appalachia gets framed right now. Like, I think Appalachia
100%.
gets blamed. I don't think Appalachia gets seen as a teacher. And I actually feel like so much of who I am, I was taught by that place, that I think makes me so much better, like as a human in the world. And yeah, it seems just so unfortunate that people are missing out on like what learning really there is to have.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, and I would say if you can point to like one good thing that came out of the book that shan't be named, it's that it has spawned creativity from other people to provide their own stories and responses to it that have been some of the best books I've ever read, and leaps and bounds better than that one. And I think, the point you mentioned earlier, which is really true about how you didn't know about any Appalachian authors and you never read about them in school. And I was thinking the same thing and wondering to myself, because I don't live in Appalachia anymore either. I live in Northern Virginia. And a lot of when I moved, I didn't have a good perspective on West Virginia. I kind of rejected being from there, rejected the identity. And I'm wondering, like, had I had the opportunity to read some of those books, like about, Dr. Bill Turner growing up the son of a black coal miner, or your story, or any of these other stories that come out of there that tell something different than what we're being fed from like a mainstream media lens, that, I think generations of Appalachians may have more fondness and pride for it, and willingness to, invest more in it, make it even better. And so I think about that a lot, especially when you mention that. And so I hope that becomes the case, because I think stories like yours are extremely important to be told. And on that, I know that we've touched on your book tangentially a little bit, but I did want to ask you a specific question about it, which is, what was your favorite story or part of it that you wrote? Because I'm sure you had a lot of nostalgia kind of dialing back to, growing up and sort of going through your history. So what was like your favorite part?
My favorite essay in the book is one that's called Be Like Wilt. It was published in the Bitter Southerner a couple years ago. It's about my basketball coach from growing up. There were not girls' basketball teams in the 80s in Cross Lanes. If you wanted to play ball, you were playing on a boys' team. So add that to the list of like other intersections. But this amazing basketball coach named Carl Bradford picked me for his team when I was in 4th grade, and he picked me every year for his team. And when I aged out of the league, he made me come back and be the assistant coach for his son's basketball team. And I wrote an essay about how he convinced me to shoot granny style in a basketball game so I could score my first basket.
Nice.
Like, that memory of just like wanting so much to make a basket and not being able to do it the way the boys were doing it. And this coach was like, it doesn't just have to be one way. Like, there's another way you can do it and it'll get you the same goal. So just do it that way. It was my favorite story to write. He just was an incredible, incredible mentor in my life, and being able to kind of like crystallize that story in more than just my head, I think is my favorite moment in the book.
Well, we love
That's
good
awesome.
basketball stories here. This is how sometimes a basketball podcast. If our listeners can tell you how great I was when I was a starting basketball player, and
I
I'm
scored
sure
all my
you were
points
just
granny style, all of them.
Exactly, right? I mean, do you ever think you'd read an essay where Wilt Chamberlain, an Indian girl, and basketball at the Cross Lanes Methodist Church were all in the same story?
I'm sold. I'm sold on it already.
All right, there you go. So
Hey, speaking of sold, I know it's not published yet, but it is available for pre-order. Is that right?
yes, it is. It's available from pre-order straight from West Virginia University Press or from any local independent bookstore. Shouts to Taylor Books in Charleston. If that's a place you feel like going, I always love going back there. But yes, it is available for pre-order, and it'll be out in March 1st, 2022.
Perfect.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm very excited about it. And Dima, I really appreciate you coming on and telling a little bit about your story about Appalachia and you growing up there, because I think that we need more people like you telling their stories, so that people who listen to this show, or also just people who want to know more about Appalachia, get a full picture of what another Appalachia than the one you may realize or may think about looks like. So I really appreciate you sharing that and coming on the show.
Thank you both for having me. And I'm going to put in a quick plug that I think we should make another Appalachia t-shirt for the collection. So just going to throw that out there as an idea.
I like it. I like it a lot. Cool.
All right.
Thanks so much.